The question started quietly at first, buried deep in comment sections and live chat replays. Someone asked how Betty could have been thanking people with purple hearts on one live stream, while neighbors said she hadn't left her bed in days. Another person noticed that the voice used in one stream sounded familiar, almost identical to something Betty had said weeks earlier. Then screenshots started circulating. Timestamps, chat logs, claims stacked on top of each other until one uncomfortable question rose to the surface and refused to go away. How could Betty Whittaker be in two places at once online? For a family that had already endured years of scrutiny, rumors, and online chaos, this was something entirely different. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about donations or houses or who helped who. This was about identity, about truth, about whether Betty herself was even being represented honestly anymore. People watching from the outside assumed answers would come quickly. They usually do online. Someone posts a receipt. Someone claps back. Someone goes live and clears the air. But this time, nothing lined up the way it normally does. And the silence from the people who mattered most only made the confusion louder. The first live stream in question had been promoted heavily. Viewers were told Betty would be present, interacting in real time, responding to messages, reacting to comments. When the stream began, her name was invoked repeatedly. The chat exploded with hearts, prayers, and messages of support. At one point, viewers were encouraged to send purple hearts because Betty loved them. People believed they were connecting with her directly, even if only through words on a screen. But almost immediately, inconsistencies appeared. Some viewers noticed that the responses attributed to Betty were vague, repetitive, and oddly timed. Others pointed out that the phrasing sounded exactly like something Betty had said in a much older video, one that had already been uploaded and widely shared. A few people clipped audio from that earlier footage and played it side by side with the livestream audio. The resemblance was undeniable. Then came the phone calls. People who had direct contact with the family reached out quietly, off camera, trying to verify what they were seeing. One call reached Larry. Another reached someone else close to the household. And the answers were consistent. Betty wasn't on a live stream. She wasn't typing messages. She wasn't interacting with anyone online at all. According to those inside the home, Betty was sick. She had been in bed. She hadn't left the house. She hadn't traveled. She hadn't gone anywhere near another person's phone or internet connection. In fact, the house itself didn't even have reliable internet access. That was when the phrase started appearing everywhere. If she wasn't there, then who was speaking for her? Chat logs were reposted. Screenshots were zoomed in on. Timestamps were compared against real-world accounts of Betty's condition. The timeline didn't just feel off. It was impossible. If what the family was saying was true, then the live stream wasn't just misleading. It was presenting a version of Betty that didn't exist in that moment. And that shook people. Because for many supporters, Betty wasn't just a figure in a story. She was the heart of it. Her words mattered. Her presence mattered. The idea that her identity could be borrowed, reused, or simulated without her consent crossed a line people weren't prepared for. Some tried to explain it away. Maybe she recorded something earlier. Maybe someone misunderstood. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding blown out of proportion. But those explanations fell apart under scrutiny. The stream hadn't been labeled as a replay. Viewers have been encouraged to interact as if Betty were responding live. Questions had been asked directly to her. Answers had supposedly come back in real time. That wasn't an accident. That was presentation. As the questions grew louder, the video disappeared. The live stream was removed, hidden, or placed behind a paywall, depending on who you asked. Some said it was taken down to avoid harassment. Others said it was quietly locked away once the inconsistencies were pointed out. The result was the same. People who wanted clarity suddenly had no access to the very footage that raised the questions in the first place. That only made things worse. In online spaces, deletion rarely signals resolution. It signals panic, and panic spreads fast. People began asking whether this had happened before. They went back through older videos, older lives, older comments. They searched for patterns. Had Betty's words ever been reused without context? Had clips been repurposed to suggest participation that wasn't real? Had anyone ever verified, beyond assumption, that she was actually present during these online moments? The deeper people looked, the more unsettled they became. Meanwhile, Betty herself remained silent, not because she had something to hide, but because she wasn't online at all. She wasn't watching the debates. She wasn't responding to accusations. She wasn't defending herself because she didn't even know she needed to. That detail hit hard. While thousands argued about where she was and what she said, Betty was reportedly resting, unaware that her name was trending again for reasons completely out of her control. That disconnect felt wrong to many people. It felt like the story had slipped away for the family entirely and become something owned by outsiders. Then the claims escalated. Some commenters accused creators of intentionally misleading viewers to drive engagement. Others went further, suggesting that Betty's identity was being used as a tool to maintain relevance, donations, or control over the narrative. Those accusations were serious, and not everyone agreed with them. But once they were out there, they couldn't be pulled back. Defenders pushed back hard. They argued that no harm was intended, that the live stream was meant to support Betty, not deceive anyone, that people were reading too much into technical issues and misunderstandings. They accused critics of overanalyzing and stirring drama. But critics weren't letting go, because this wasn't just about a stream. It was about trust. For months, viewers have been asked to believe different versions of events from different voices, all claiming to speak for the family. Each time something didn't add up, the explanation was that people should stop questioning and just support. But support without truth has limits, and many felt that limit had finally been reached. The phrase "two places at once" became symbolic. It wasn't literal, not really. No one believed Betty had physically been in two locations. What they believed was worse, that her presence had been manufactured, that her voice had been separated from her body, that her identity had been used without clarity or consent. And once people start believing that, everything changes. Every previous statement gets re-examined. Every promise gets questioned. Every claim of transparency gets weighed against this moment where transparency seemed to vanish completely. By the end of the week, the community was fractured. Some people walked away entirely, exhausted by the confusion and conflict. Others doubled down, demanding explanations, accountability, and proof. A smaller group tried to refocus attention back on Betty herself, reminding everyone that she was a real person, not a character in an online mystery. But even they couldn't ignore what had happened, because whether intentional or not, the situation had created a reality where Betty Whittaker's name was used in a space she wasn't actually present in. And for a family that had already lost control of its story so many times, this felt like another line crossed. The biggest question remained unanswered. If Betty wasn't there, why present it as if she was? And until that question is answered honestly, the shock won't fade. It will linger, just like the screenshots, the clips, and the uneasy feeling that something deeply personal was handled far too casually. Comment below and share your thoughts. The fallout from that live stream didn't slow down. It intensified. Once people accepted the possibility that Betty had not actually been present, the conversation shifted from confusion to accountability. Viewers weren't just asking what happened anymore. They were asking why it happened and who benefited from presenting Betty as active when she allegedly wasn't. The first major fracture appeared between two groups of supporters. One side believed the situation was an honest misunderstanding fueled by poor communication and technical shortcuts. The other believed it was deliberate, not malicious in intent, perhaps, but deliberate in execution. To them, the distinction mattered less than the outcome. Betty's name had been used to anchor attention, emotion, and engagement in a moment where she had no voice. That realization unsettled people. In online culture, presence equals power. When someone appears live, responding, reacting, acknowledging the audience, it creates trust. Viewers feel seen. They feel connected. And when that presence turns out to be questionable, the trust collapses almost instantly. People began replaying the live stream in their heads, recalling moments that hadn't seemed strange at the time. The way responses came seconds too late. The way questions were acknowledged without being answered. The way the conversation flowed more like a script than a dialogue. In hindsight, what once felt comforting now felt staged. That's when another detail resurfaced. Several viewers remembered being told that Betty doesn't really use the internet and doesn't understand live streams. That had always been framed as endearing, a sign of her simplicity and authenticity. But now, it raised a different question. If she wasn't comfortable online, why was she suddenly being portrayed as actively engaging in a fast-moving live chat? The contradiction was hard to ignore. As people compared notes, one thing became clear. Nobody could point to a single, verifiable moment where Betty herself had confirmed she was present during that stream. No video clip, no live audio, no direct confirmation. Everything rested on implication. And implication, people realized, is powerful but dangerous. At the same time, messages reportedly coming from inside the household painted a very different picture. According to those accounts, Betty had been unwell for days. She wasn't answering calls. She wasn't receiving visitors. She was resting. The idea that she was participating in an online event, even passively, didn't align with reality. That gap between perception and reality became the center of the storm. Some supporters tried to redirect the conversation, urging others to focus on the bigger picture. They argued that nitpicking a live stream missed the point, that Betty needed support, not skepticism, that questioning these details only hurt the family. But others pushed back firmly. They argued that truth was not nitpicking, that protecting Betty meant protecting her identity, not borrowing it for convenience. They pointed out that if people were willing to misrepresent her presence now, what else might have been misrepresented before? That question lingered. The situation became even more complicated when people began noticing how quickly dissenting comments disappeared. Posts questioning the live stream were deleted. Users asking for clarification were muted or blocked. Entire threads vanished overnight. To some, this was moderation. To others, it looked like suppression. And suppression always invites suspicion. People started archiving what they could. Screenshots, chat logs, cached pages. They shared them quietly at first, then more openly as confidence grew. The goal wasn't to attack, at least not for most. It was to preserve evidence before it disappeared completely. In the middle of all this, Betty remained unreachable. That absence became symbolic. Everyone was speaking about her. Few were speaking to her. And that imbalance weighed heavily on people who had followed the family for years. They remembered Betty's discomfort with attention, her confusion when cameras appeared, her simple request to be left alone at times. Using her presence, real or implied, without her awareness felt like a betrayal of that history. Another layer emerged when people began questioning who actually had access to Betty's voice, recordings, or likeness. Old clips resurfaced, showing moments where her words had been emotional, direct, and deeply personal. Those moments had once been shared to humanize her. Now, people worried they could be repurposed. The idea that a recorded voice could be played as if it were live disturbed many. Not because technology allows it, but because ethics should prevent it. The defenders argued there was no proof of manipulation, no confirmation that audio was reused, no smoking gun. And they were right, technically. But the absence of proof didn't erase the absence of clarity. If anything, it amplified the demand for transparency. Transparency never came. Instead, the silence stretched on. No clear statement. No explanation addressing the specific claims. Just general reassurances that everything was being handled with good intentions. Good intentions, however, were no longer enough. For many viewers, this wasn't about catching someone in a lie. It was about respect, about whether Betty Whittaker, a woman whose life had already been dissected and debated by millions, was still being treated as a person rather than a symbol. The phrase "two places at once" took on a deeper meaning. It wasn't about geography. It was about control, about how a person's identity can exist in one place while their image is projected somewhere else, shaped by people with louder voices and bigger platforms. And once people see that happening, they can't unsee it. As days passed, the conversation cooled slightly, but the damage remained. Trust, once fractured, doesn't heal quickly. Some viewers unsubscribed quietly. Others stayed, watching more critically than before. A few continued defending, believing that any scrutiny only fueled unnecessary drama. But even among defenders, unease crept in, because if Betty truly wasn't there, then something fundamental had gone wrong, and pretending otherwise wouldn't fix it. The family had already been through too much to deserve another layer of confusion piled on top of their pain. Many supporters began asking for a reset, a pause, a commitment that nothing would be shared in Betty's name unless she explicitly approved and participated. Whether that request would be honored remained unclear. What was clear was this: the story had crossed a threshold. It was no longer just about updates or support. It was about representation, about who gets to speak and who gets spoken for. And until that imbalance is addressed honestly, the shock won't fade. It will simply evolve, reshaping how every future update is received. As the dust from the live stream controversy settled, the focus shifted again. Not outward this time, but inward. People began asking harder questions, not just about what they saw, but about their own role in it. How had so many accepted the idea of Betty being present without proof? Why had the illusion felt comforting enough to override logic? That discomfort mattered, because once the audience started questioning itself, the story stopped being about a single live stream and became about a pattern of representation without consent, of voices being spoken for instead of listened to, of silence being filled by assumption. Supporters who had followed the Whittaker family since the earliest videos remembered something important. Betty had never been comfortable being the center of attention. She tolerated cameras. She endured interviews. She answered questions because she trusted the people asking them. But she rarely initiated. She rarely spoke unless prompted. Her power had always come from her presence, not her performance. That's what made the idea of her suddenly engaging in rapid-fire online chat feel wrong to so many. People began rewatching older footage, not to catch inconsistencies, but to reconnect with who Betty actually was. Her cadence, her pauses, her expressions, the way she would look to someone else before answering, as if checking whether it was okay to speak. None of that aligned with the confident, responsive online persona implied during the disputed livestream. That contrast became impossible to ignore. At the same time, Others began reflecting on how easily the narrative had slipped out of Betty's hands long before this moment. Over time, updates about her life had become increasingly filtered through intermediaries. Friends, advocates, creators, supporters. Each one added interpretation, context, opinion. Eventually, interpretation replaced presence. That realization hurt, because many viewers believed they were protecting Betty by defending the people around her. They thought loyalty meant silence, that questioning details would only create chaos. But now they were facing the uncomfortable truth that silence can also enable harm. Not dramatic harm, not malicious harm, but quiet harm, the kind that erodes dignity piece by piece. The conversation grew quieter but deeper. Less shouting, more reflection. People began sharing personal stories of loved ones whose voices had been overridden for their own good. Adults with disabilities, elderly parents, family members whose silence was mistaken for consent. Those stories changed the tone. This wasn't gossip anymore. It was about agency. The question became simple but heavy. Who gets to decide when someone speaks? In Betty's case, the answer had blurred. Over time, urgency replaced consent. Updates replaced check-ins. The audience wanted reassurance, and reassurance was provided, even if the source was unclear. That trade-off was no longer acceptable to many. Some supporters began calling for a complete pause on public updates unless Betty herself was visibly, verifiably involved. Not implied, not represented, involved. Others suggested appointing a neutral third party to communicate factual updates without interpretation or emotional framing. Those ideas didn't gain traction publicly, but they mattered privately. They signaled a shift in values. Meanwhile, the silence from those at the center of the controversy continued. No clarification, no acknowledgement of confusion, just distance. That silence spoke louder than any live stream ever could. People began to understand something else, too. Even if no one intended to mislead, the outcome was still misleading. Intent doesn't erase impact. And when dealing with someone as vulnerable and scrutinized as Betty, the margin for error should be smaller, not wider. The phrase "two places at once" took on another meaning. Betty existed in her home, living her reality. But online, she existed as a symbol, a reassurance, a reason to stay engaged. Those two versions had drifted apart, and the distance between them was causing harm. Supporters wrestled with guilt. Had they contributed to this by demanding constant updates? By expecting access? By equating silence with danger and presence with safety? Those questions didn't have easy answers, but they mattered, because for the first time, the audience wasn't asking what happened. They were asking what should happen next. And many agreed on one thing. Whatever comes next has to center Betty's reality, not the internet's expectations. That means fewer updates, not more. Slower communication, not constant reassurance. And above all, clarity over comfort. The cost of speaking for someone had finally become visible. And once that cost is seen, it can't be ignored. As the conversation moved forward, one truth remained steady beneath all the noise. Betty Whittaker doesn't owe the internet her presence. She doesn't owe explanations, appearances, or proof of existence. Her life is not content, and her silence is not a problem to be solved. If the community truly wants to support her, it starts by respecting that. Part 4 will examine where this leaves the story now, what trust looks like going forward, and whether accountability can exist without cruelty. Comment below. Do you think Betty's voice has been overshadowed by those claiming to speak for her? Or is the internet expecting more access than it has a right to? By the time the dust settled and the comments section slowed, it became clear that this moment was not just another flare-up in a long-running online saga. Something deeper had cracked open. What began as confusion over a chat, a voice, and the claim that Betty appeared to be in two places at once had exposed a much larger problem, one that could no longer be brushed off as drama, misunderstanding, or internet noise. This wasn't about rival creators. It wasn't about loyalty to one channel over another. It wasn't even about proving who was right or wrong in a single moment. It was about how easily truth can be bent when silence is used as evidence and implication is treated as confirmation. For many people watching, this was the first time they stepped back and asked a harder question. How did we get here? The answer is uncomfortable because it forces a look at collective behavior, not just individual actions. Over time, the Whittaker story became something people felt entitled to. Updates were expected. Appearances were assumed. Silence was interpreted, explained, and filled in by others. And slowly, a dangerous pattern formed. One where the absence of a vulnerable person's direct voice was treated as permission to speak for them. That is where things cross a line. When someone is not present, not online, not speaking publicly, the ethical response is restraint. Instead, what unfolded was the opposite. The lack of clarity became a stage for performance. The uncertainty was smoothed over with implication. And for some viewers, that realization hit hard. Not because they wanted scandal, but because they suddenly understood how fragile the truth had become. Once that realization sets in, it changes how you see everything that came before it. Supporters who had followed the Whittaker family for years began reassessing their own roles. Many admitted they had grown used to constant access. They had grown accustomed to hearing updates, seeing faces, being reassured that everything was fine. When that reassurance came without verification, something fell off, but only after the fact. That delay is important. It shows how trust, once established, can override skepticism. People didn't question the situation at first because they didn't want to believe something was wrong. They wanted stability. They wanted continuity. And that desire made them vulnerable to accepting implication as fact. This doesn't make them foolish. It makes them human. But it does highlight why responsibility matters so much when dealing with real people whose lives are already fragile. When audiences are emotionally invested, they will often accept whatever helps them feel calm. That is why those with influence must be especially careful. Reassurance should never come at the expense of truth. Another layer of this moment is the issue of silence itself. Silence can mean many things. It can mean rest. It can mean illness. It can mean privacy. It can mean exhaustion. What it cannot responsibly mean is automatic consent for others to narrate someone's reality. Yet that is exactly what happened. In the absence of Betty's confirmed presence, others filled in the gaps. They spoke confidently. They implied connection. They created a sense of participation that could not be verified. And once people realized that, trust didn't just wobble, it fractured. The most painful part is that none of this required malicious intent to cause harm. Harm doesn't need villains. It only needs imbalance. And this situation was defined by imbalance, of power, of access, of voice. Betty does not control platforms. She does not manage narratives. She does not jump into comment sections to correct misinformation. That makes her especially vulnerable to being spoken over, spoken for, or spoken about without recourse. In those circumstances, the ethical burden shifts heavily onto those who claim to represent her or speak in her interest. Representation without verification is not protection. It is risk. As more people process this, a quiet shift began to occur. The loudest voices faded. In their place were quieter comments, repeated again and again in different words. I don't need updates. I just want her to be okay. That sentiment matters. It reflects a move away from consumption and toward care. Care doesn't demand proof on demand. Care respects boundaries. Care understands that a person's worth is not measured by how often they appear online. This is where the internet struggles the most. Online spaces reward immediacy. They punish pauses. They turn silence into suspicion and gaps into opportunities for speculation. But real life does not move at algorithmic speed. Healing doesn't happen on a schedule. Privacy doesn't announce itself. And vulnerable people do not owe the public anything simply because they were once visible. What this moment revealed is how easily the internet forgets that. There is also the question of authority. Over time, proximity to a story is mistaken for ownership of it. Being close becomes a substitute for accountability. But closeness can distort judgment just as much as distance can. Emotional investment, especially when mixed with public pressure, can lead people to make choices that feel protective in the moment, but are harmful in the long run. Speaking for someone who hasn't spoken is one of those choices. If this story is to move forward in a healthier direction, it requires a reset of expectations. No more implied appearances. No more secondhand certainty presented as firsthand truth. No more emotional theater filling in for clarity. If Betty speaks publicly, it should be unmistakable and verifiable.